Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of Peralta Online Equity Conference. Thank you so much for being here today as well. We have wonderful sessions. Please check out the schedule and hopefully you will join the ones you like. If you miss anything, so for example, currently we have another session going on. Don't worry, you're missing that one because hopefully by next week, we're going to upload all the sessions on our YouTube channel. And I'm going to share our YouTube channel in the chat box in a bit so that you can subscribe and watch all the videos, not only this year, last year's videos as well. So please keep that in mind. I'm DEIB. I'm the moderator of this session, and I'm super excited to introduce the second session of the day, Breaking Down Barriers, Empowering Learner Choice Through Universal Design and Technology. As you know, universal design is one of the rubric criteria. So we're also excited to listen to Katie Grenell as she speaks. So Katie, whenever you're ready, you can take it over. And when you're getting ready, I will also just remind everyone a few housekeeping items. So first of all, please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking to minimize background noise. And also, please pose your questions using the chat function that we'll moderate and discuss with our presenter later on. Toward the end of the hour, we'll share how we can continue the conversation online and share some additional sources to support your teaching. Lastly, we are using automated Zoom captions, and we will edit the recording transcripts before we share them with you. At the bottom of the Zoom window, you will see a closed caption button, and you will see the live transcript text underneath that button. Select to turn them on or off as you prefer. So Katie, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, DEIB. I appreciate it. Thank you everybody for being here. Sorry, I'm paying attention. I have like the two screen, thing going on right here. So I'm just trying to get everything set up. Just one, I would say, kind of housekeeping item as well that I wanted to mention is that I will be turning my camera off during the actual presentation. For whatever reason, it seems to kind of slow down the bandwidth of things, and I want that to be the experience for everybody. So I did just want to kind of share that I will be doing that. And so I'm going to begin right now and turn my camera off, and then we can start. So let's do this as everybody sees this lovely view of me. All right, there we go. Okay. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really happy to have all of you here. I hope the conference has been going well. And I'm just excited to be here. So the title of my presentation is called Breaking Down Barriers, Empowering Learner Choice Through Universal Design and Technology. My name is Dr. Katie Grenell, and I am going to take it away from here. All right, so before I go into, kind of the meat of the presentation, if you will, I just wanted to provide an agenda. I always like to give everybody an idea of what we'll be talking about today. So really, I'll start with some introductions and some positionality. I know that's a really important way to begin any type of conversation and presentation. And then I will begin by looking at the fundamentals of accessibility and inclusive design. And the reason I'll be mentioning this is we like to think of that as kind of that foundational ethical experience and framework for how we approach the product that I'll be talking about, which is called Anthology Ally. So then I will talk a little bit about the tool itself and really kind of some of the different functions that it has. The one thing I did want to point out, though, is that really the focus of this is on the student experience. So knowing that this is an equity conference and that's so critical, I want to make sure that we are, kind of focused on that. I'm just going to see if there's a way for me to turn off the notification every time somebody joins in. I don't know. So just give me one moment, everybody, because I'm sure you don't want to hear that all the time. All right, I don't know if there's a way that I can do that. So just
it's under participants.
It's under, oh, lovely. Okay, let's see. I can do this.
In the bottom, there should be a little 3 dots, and then you can turn off sound there.
Oh my gosh, you're amazing.
Thank
Thank you. I don't know why I
You're
whispered that. I want everybody to know. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, thank you very much. See, what a community. So, we'll talk about Anthology Ally, and it has several different features, but the main feature for students is the alternative format. So that's really the focus of today. And then I'll share some suggestions about how to communicate with students about alternative formats, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So again, I'm really very happy to be here, and I think it's important to start, so that you all know who I am. I always put this screenshot or this headshot of me, but really this is me in my glory, the picture of me and my family. We went to an alpaca farm in central Pennsylvania a couple of years ago, and this alpaca, his name was Cordon Bleu, and he was just great at, posing for pictures. So this is my family and I.
Katie, sorry to interrupt.
Oh.
We can't see the picture.
Well, that's not helpful.
Yes, now we can see it. Okay.
Better. There we go. Okay. Thank you for letting me know. I appreciate that. So here is this lovely picture at the alpaca farm. And I've got my son, Jake, my daughter, Charlotte, she's my mini-me, and then my husband, Mitch. And yes, this is me just on my own, but really, I think too, like this is such a big part of who I am. So that's my family. Again, my name is Dr. Katie Grenell. I currently work as an accessibility strategist at Anthology. So Anthology is a really, really large ed tech company. We started off very small and, have since kind of grown and merged with other companies and things like that. So in my role, what I do as an accessibility strategist is I work with and strategize with institutions that have Ally, which is our accessibility tool. So I love being able to do that and do trainings and things like that. But my first foray into even using Ally before was actually as an adjunct instructor. So I have a PhD in American Studies. I've been teaching history and American Studies for over 15 years. And even before COVID, I was doing a lot of it online just because I was working in a full-time position. And it's really given me the opportunity to explore more, methods of, online pedagogy and instruction, but also learn a lot more about digital accessibility. So for me, I love being able to mention the fact that when I first learned about Ally as a tool, it was not as an employee at Anthology. I was working as an adjunct instructor at Buffalo State University. It's part of the SUNY system here in New York. And the icon for the alternative formats popped up one day, and that was how I learned about it. And since then, it's just kind of interesting how life works out, and it's sort of come full circle where now I get to work with institutions that have that tool. But I've learned a lot along the way, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of communication and really more equitable communication and access. So I'm very happy to be able to kind of speak to that today and just talk a little bit about both my teaching experience and some of the suggestions I have and why a tool like this is so important, but then also thinking about it from an actual strategist, standpoint. So I always like to begin with looking at this academic wheel of positionality. So there's a lot of different variations of this. So you might have seen something like this before. This is more recent. This is called the academic wheel of privilege. And it was created by Dr. Flavio Acevedo. He's a political psychologist and I think associate researcher at University of Cambridge. So a lot of the times what we see with wheels like this, these kind of like positionality wheels, is usually power is in the middle of it. But in this instance, we see that it's the academic wheel of privilege, right? So just replacing that. So the idea here is that the closer that we get to the center of that privilege or power, that you are, the more power and privilege you have. So without going into my entire history, I like to begin just with a brief statement of positionality so that you have a better sense of where I'm coming from with this presentation. So I am a white, straight, disabled woman. I have both visible and invisible disabilities. And I mention that in particular because it's such a big part of my positionality, but then also my approach. So yes, as an accessibility strategist, but really just as a human. So I did want to mention that there are other privileges that I do have, and I'm not glossing over them by not mentioning them, but just for the purposes of this presentation, I did want to, situate myself within that space. So what we're going to do is begin by looking at digital accessibility and inclusive design, what I would call the Anthology Ally approach. So a lot of these things, I imagine some of you on this call have already heard about them, you know about them. You very likely are, just complete experts in them. But it's important the way that we look at Anthology Ally as a tool, but really think about what is its actual ethical approach. What are the, the foundational ideas and systems that we are using or frameworks to be able to then create and sustain a tool like this, because they're very much intertwined. So I always like to start with more, I would say, general or basic definitions, because I think from there we can kind of build upon that and have this be the foundation. So in looking at the definitions of accessibility and digital accessibility, we have these two definitions that we use, and I have all of my sources listed at the end of this. So this first definition is about what it means to be accessible. And it reads, accessible means that individuals with disabilities are able to independently acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services within the same time frame as individuals without disabilities, with substantially equivalent ease of use. So this quote, and I'm blanking off the top of my head, I believe it's from the University of Montana, their accessibility office. I just thought it was a really very poignant, but also concrete definition. And I wanted to bring this up in particular because it kind of, is the precursor to digital accessibility. So really thinking about what are these kind of underlying definitions that we're using to approach how we provide a product and the services like Ally. This next definition is digital accessibility, and this I believe is coming from the Georgetown School of Law, their specific accessibility office. I just love this definition here as well. Again, I think it's very accessible. And it states that digital accessibility refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites, to digital tools and technologies by people with disabilities. So really, again, at the core, we're really trying to break down as many barriers as possible. Yes, for our users and our learners and our students with disabilities, but also for everybody else as well. So looking at it from also that universal design standpoint. So I like to include this here as well when we're talking about what I've recently just started calling alphabet soup. So the DEIB alphabet soup. So for those of you, I'm sure, you've heard of this or some other variation of this acronym. So typically that DEIB, it's an acronym that stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. These are different programs, initiatives, often, entire offices that are really working to create a more inclusive, diverse, equitable, sense of belonging type of, I would say, teaching and learning environment, but overall culture at their institution. And there's lots of different ways that we see this. But I mentioned that this is essentially a bit of an alphabet soup because every institution is going to do something a little differently, right? Occasionally we'll see justice added in there into that alphabet soup acronym. And what we do see, though, is that accessibility is typically left out of there. And we see this a lot. And it's just one of those things I'm still trying to figure out why. In some instances, it seems to be intentional, and others it seems unintentional, or just this assumption that it is inherently a part of some of these pillars, if you will. But the way that I see it and the way that we approach this, with our tool is that accessibility must encompass equity and inclusivity. Otherwise, it's not truly accessible. And so really, it's really critical that we're kind of expanding this idea of this alphabet soup. And I say that jokingly, but again, it's just so many different variations. But accessibility should be a part of that. It needs to be a part of that. And a lot of institutions will kind of approach these as separate pillars or entities. But I find that they are intersectionally linked and connected, but they should still be individually called out, right? We still need to be able to name this. And I do hope that this begins to change. We're starting to see more schools adding accessibility into that. But it's, in my biased opinion, as a disabled woman, I feel like a lot of it has to do with discomfort around something like disability, which is then, of course, inextricably linked to accessibility. So before I go off completely on a different tangent that doesn't have anything to do with today's presentation, I will continue to move on. So in thinking about, again, what is the framework for how we're coming up with a tool like Ally, and what is the purpose? What is the whole point? We think a lot about universal design for learning. So UDL for short, yet another acronym. So UDL is at its core a learning framework. It's designed to improve and optimize the teaching and learning experience for all people, that's based on the different scientific insights and ways that humans learn. It's pretty fascinating in terms of the way that this is structured. And the whole point of UDL, of having a learning framework like this, is to be able to enhance access to learning by reducing as many barriers as possible. So those physical barriers, cognitive, intellectual, organizational barriers, any other obstacles to learning that are problematic. The whole idea of having something like UDL is to have it more universally designed for everybody from the very beginning, and breaking down those barriers so that you're not necessarily having to retrofit or go back and correct and modify and things like that. And to make it a more equitable and accessible experience for everybody from the very beginning. So the three different principles that UDL is based on, and I will just bring these up. This is supposed to be a brain, this image right here, but it sort of looks like a fist. Just felt very compelled to point that out. So we're looking at the multiple means of engagement, the multiple means of representation, and then lastly, the multiple means of action and expression. So I bring up these three individual principles, and then of course, built within these principles, there's other guidelines that fit into that. But I bring this up because really the core connector here between these principles is the use of the word multiple. So UDL is so much about multiplicity and offering different options for different learners based on not just their needs, but their preferences, abilities, even the devices that they're using, right? Certain devices are more conducive to certain types of content. So with UDL principles, and we're thinking about having all of these different multiple means of engagement and representation and action and expression, then we need to think about, as a company and for our tool, how is it that Ally can help to embody these different, multiple options, and to, enforce these principles that really do serve that overarching framework. That also brings us to universal design. And I have found that there's a lot of conflation between universal design for learning and then universal design. And these are in fact two separate things. And I bring this up in particular because I think universal design, the way that I look at it is, we have this first bullet point that is saying that it's the intersection of accessibility and usability. And I think a lot of it has to do with kind of the logistical access to either the physical, the digital space. It's how can the person have access to it? And a more, of course, I would say, eloquent definition is the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. So everything that we've kind of talked about already so far, we're looking at universal design for learning, really staying true to, bringing about the definition of digital or just accessibility to the work that we do. All of that is meant to serve as this kind of foundation, this ethical foundation, technological foundation for our tool. But a lot of that also has to do with the different types of learners that we are trying to be mindful of, that we're trying to support, that we're trying to, I would say empower. So in thinking about all of these different frameworks and, ideas and theories and things like that, we also need to think about the actual learners, right? So having a tool like Anthology Ally or any of these other accessibility tools, and being more mindful of that, is supporting this much more diverse and growing body of, what we would call our 21st century learners. So this, visual list here is not a finite list, right? It's not fully comprehensive. This is just, when we're thinking about as many learners as possible, these are kind of some of the different categories. We have our learners that have a visible disability. So they might need something that is going to be more keyboard navigable because of that. We have down at the bottom our temporary disability. So perhaps a student or a learner that had some type of surgery or accident where they might need some type of modification or accommodation from a temporary standpoint. We have up at the top, in the top left-hand corner, the non-traditional students. And I've put this in quotation marks because I think that this term itself is going through a pretty significant change. And I think our previous notion of what it meant to be a non-traditional student is that's kind of outdated. Because that typically implied, a student that was working, that might also be a caregiver or a parent and going to school. That is the majority of our students that are, working and also going to school at the same time. We also have our international students. So these are, students that are needing to make sure that not only do they have access to the correct language so that they can, access the content and it's an equitable experience. We also want to make sure from a cultural standpoint as well that they also have a more equitable, entrance into learning and a different type of learning environment. We have our learners that are parents. We have our learners that might be caregivers. There's a lot of different, kind of hats that we wear that would make us these, I guess you could say, the more non-traditional students. But we want to be mindful of that. We have our learners that might have an invisible disability. Our first generation students where, they need to relearn or learn, they don't have the benefit perhaps of others that have been able to share their experiences and some of these kind of core components of the hidden curriculum. So they have a lot to learn in that capacity as well. So we want to make it an equitable experience. We also have our learners who are using mobile devices primarily to do their work. And perhaps some of those are also, when we think about, it sounds like a weird way to describe it, but lifestyle learners. So this is really more for those students and learners that are living in very rural areas. Perhaps they don't have strong internet connection. Perhaps they have a long commute to and from work. So we're trying to think of, how can we best support them in all of these different roles and hats that they might wear. So that brings us to Anthology Ally. So what I want to do is begin by just breaking down what it is and really then building from there and talking about how it supports students. So Anthology Ally is an accessibility tool that is embedded in your learning management system, and its full intention is designed to make digital course content more accessible and inclusive. So Ally is just essentially, again, this is embedded right within your learning management system. It's actually LMS agnostic. So I am going to use the LMS acronym just for sake of time. But so it is LMS agnostic. It can be embedded into Canvas or Brightspace, D2L, Moodle, Blackboard, Schoology. So again, it doesn't necessarily matter which of those that you use. It just is an automatic, embedded LTI. That's really kind of a beautiful thing to help making things more accessible and inclusive. So when we think of who is Ally for, first and foremost, we're thinking of these different targeted audiences. So for our students, Ally provides alternative formats of content. So an example would be an instructor uploads their syllabus, And let's say the student is wanting to have it as an audio version, they could download that. That's an option for them. Or perhaps they need a Braille ready file format because they use an electronic Braille display. They could also download it and access it that way. So again, this is where we see those notions of multiplicity and UDL really coming to light, to empower our students to be able to have access and flexibility and choice in the content that they are engaging with. Ally helps instructors, and then it provides feedback and guidance to instructors on the content that they are uploading and or creating directly into their LMS. And I have a little asterisk at the end of this to indicate that instructors also have access to alternative formats. So if an instructor wanted to, as an example, just to kind of get refreshed and prepare for a lecture that day that might have been on an article that they had assigned, they could download that as an audio version and listen to it in the commute or, in the morning, making breakfast, working out, what have you, right? So again, it's having that kind of flexibility there as well. And for administrators, it provides detailed data and insights to help further improve overall course content accessibility at the institution. So this is really about helping an institution get a sense of overall how accessible are they as far as the digital course content goes. And, what is some of the usage data? So it's really fascinating to be able to see how many, learners had actually gone in and downloaded an alternative format. Or it's also empowering to be able to see that, in the fall of 2022, 400, pieces of content were improved upon by using Ally. So again, there's different purposes based on the different audiences, but this is really kind of at its core what we're talking about here. So in terms of how Ally can help, there's a lot of different ways. And again, this list here is not complete by any means. There are more. But to start with, if we think about it in the perspective of the student, it really improves the overall student experience because it is giving students choice, flexibility, autonomy, and how they consume the content. And I think that has a lot to do with, not just where they are in their moment and not necessarily if they do identify as disabled, but it has a lot to do with, their space in life at the moment. For parents to be able to, cook dinner and fold laundry, we live in a world where multitasking is kind of necessary. So how can we support, our students and our learners and our instructors in ways that will allow them to continue to do things from an equitable point of access? Ally also helps to increase awareness and provide guidance to instructors, again, to give them the what, the why, and the how is what I like to call it for how they can fix their content. So Ally will give them, let's say they'll take one specific syllabus that is a Word document, and let's say Ally has found 3 accessibility related issues with it. Well, Ally will provide the what. So it will define what the issues are. Because it's not fair to expect that everybody knows what missing alternative text means. So Ally will define it. So it gives the what, it will then give the why. And that is typically if I don't fix this, who is it going to hurt? So it's really important to think about specific use cases. So in this instance, not having alt text would 100% impact the experience or the access even for a learner that is using a screen reader or perhaps any type of text-to-speech functionality. And then lastly, it will provide the how, right? So that how do you go about fixing the items? And that's really where that guidance comes in. So this third and final point here is in terms of how Ally can help, we're also thinking about how it supports accessibility and multimodal learning, universal design, also universal design for learning, and then different types of quality course design initiatives that we see are a little different at every single institution. So that really brings us to the kind of the core feature that Ally provides for students. So that is our alternative formats. So what I wanted to do is talk a little briefly about that and how they function. So what we're looking at right here is a screenshot of an example of, up at the top, it says Van Gogh bio, and this is a Word document. So in this instance, this experience is essentially a learner, so either a student or an instructor going in, logging into their LMS, clicking on the alternative format icon, and they're brought to something like this. So this is the list of all of the different types of formats that we offer. So, and I will go through each of them, but essentially all this is the prompt for a learner to go in and to actually download an alternative format, and they can use that however they need to. So there's no maximum amount of times that a learner can do this. There's nothing like that. There's no big scary red button that will say you've hit your max. There is also no disclosure here, which I think is really important, and I'll talk about a little bit in just a moment. So this, again, is just trying to show that really the alternative formats, really all it is that it's giving students the ability to access course content in a variety of alternative formats. So again, it's going to support those that have specific learner needs, abilities, preferences, right? It could also be where they are in the moment. Are they in a library? Are they, on the bus trying to get to school? So we want to make sure that we have different types of formats to really then be more conducive to those different learning environments. So really, again, at its core, the alternative formats feature is providing students with options to engage with their course content based off of needs and preferences and things like that. And really, my absolute favorite point when talking about alternative formats is that it provides students with autonomy. And what I really mean by that is a student does not need to request access to alternative formats. A student does not need to have any type of official accommodation. They do not need to, disclose that they identify as disabled. None of those things need to happen. Once Ally is enabled for a course, it's available. These alternative formats are available to everybody. And I think that makes it to be even more empowering, right? So it's anybody has access to this. And as I've mentioned before, it really does support different learner needs and preferences, abilities, and then also devices. And I specifically point that out because there are certain formats here that are much more conducive to mobile devices. So HTML in particular, it's great for using that on a smaller device, because when you are downloading anything as an HTML file, all that really means is that it's going to be responsive to screen size. So a learner doesn't need to zoom and pinch. It's going to automatically respond to the device that it's being opened on. So these are all of the different types of alternative format options that Ally currently offers. So again, what we're talking about here is an instructor going in and adding, let's say, a Word document, their syllabus or something like that. I feel like that's a pretty universal example. Then a student, or even themselves, the actual faculty themselves, could go in and have access to all of these different types of alternative formats for that one specific content item. So we have OCR PDFs, and that stands for optical character recognition. So this is when you want to make sure that a scanned PDF, which is really, it's just taking a picture of something, and it's missing all of that kind of metadata that's really important and critical for students that are using any type of either text-to-speech functionality or a screen reader. On a similar note, we have the tagged PDFs. So when you tag a PDF, this provides, I like to call them like identification labels to certain parts of a document. So your title, your subtitle, your begin paragraph, begin block quote, things like that. So that's giving that semantic structure for a learner that is either not able to see or read the screen or is choosing not to in that moment. We also have HTML files, EPUB files. So this is just an electronic publication file that works with an e-reader. So Thorium is one that we use pretty frequently, and it's just a free download. But there's lots of customization capabilities with using something like this. So it's a really neat tool. We also have the Braille Ready file format. So this would be for learners that are already using what's called either an electronic Braille display or a refreshable Braille display. We have audio files, and this, can be used for kind of a multimodal learning experience. So if you want to read and then listen to something at the same time, or if this is strictly for any learner that has a vision impairment. We also have the Beeline reader. So this was a tool, it was designed as a speed reading tool. It was actually designed by a lawyer. As he was prepping for the bar exam, he was getting frustrated that there wasn't something better out there to help with speed reading. So he had a cousin that was a software developer, and they together worked on the Beeline reader. And basically what it does is it adds color gradients to different parts of the word. So it's intended to kind of guide your eye through it. Another really neat tool. We also have translated versions. So we partner with AWS, and it's a machine generated translated version in over 70 different languages. And then our most recent alternative format offering is the Microsoft Immersive Reader. So this is a really neat tool. If you haven't seen it before, kind of played around with it, you can use it to kind of customize the reading and learning experience for one of these different types of content items. But you can also, it's a reading and comprehension tool. So it can help learners that are, working on, improving grammar or really trying to work on the kind of learning and reading comprehension. You can highlight different parts of speech. So you could have it so that all of the verbs are highlighted in red to, again, help you learn about these different parts of speech. So these are all the different types of alternative format options that we have. And again, there's no like system of checks and balances to make sure a student, qualifies to be able to have access to this. Once it's turned on for everybody. So some of the benefits of having alternative formats, and I've mentioned this already, probably all of these things already before, but first and foremost, it doesn't require students to have any official accommodations. This is not by any way are we trying to indicate or recommend students do not go and get accommodations. But I think this also helps in those instances where perhaps a student, doesn't know that they have, maybe that they are neurodivergent, or they don't want to disclose because that was a traumatic experience for them, right? The whole point of something like alternative formats is to make it equitable for everybody. The alternative formats also embody universal design for learning and universal design. They're providing multiple ways that the content can be engaged with, and then also that autonomy to all students, which I really think just cannot be, reiterated enough. I think that is just a critical component of this. So what I wanted to do is share a brief video. So we recently had I had the opportunity to meet with a student, an undergraduate student who is attending the University of Buffalo. Her name is Carrie. And she shared with me just kind of her, experiences using Ally. And this is admittedly one of the harder things to do in terms of getting our students that use Ally at all to be able to kind of share their experience. And so we wanted to make sure that we were kind of able to at least try and equitably represent what one of our students had felt. So I'm going to play this.
Hello, my name is Carrie, and I'm currently an undergraduate student at the University at Buffalo studying environmental engineering. I am here to briefly talk about the impact that Anthology Ally has had on my learning experience so far. I was recently introduced to Ally through the alternative format icon that pops up next to my course content, and I had kind of always seen that it was there, but I never really bothered to click on it. But now that I know what it is and what it can do for me, I think it's very exciting. It's very comforting that I can download things in basically any format I want. I see a lot of PowerPoint slides in my major, and it's nice to know that I can break up the monotony of sifting through the slides by downloading them as an audio file if I want. And I also really like that to use Ally, you don't have to have an official accommodation. You don't have to have a disability. And if you do have a disability, you don't have to disclose it. I think that really increases accessibility and makes students more likely to use it. I think students would use it more if they were informed about it, because I know that a lot of my peers have no clue what the alternative formats are, because I have told them, I said, oh, did you know that you can download things in alternative formats? And they had no idea what I was talking about. So I think that institutions should really take advantage of communicating the accessibility that they provide and continue using Ally and informing students about what it can do for them and their learning.
And that was the end of the video. And so what I thought would be helpful, I mean, I've had a wonderful chat with Carrie before she recorded this, and we just kind of talked a little bit more about her experiences. And she did identify as not disabled, and she also gave me permission to share that, so that she realized she was coming at this from a different type of perspective. But again, that she felt that it really did help in terms of feeling more comfortable with the content. And so what I thought would be helpful is to kind of go through some of the takeaways that I had from her experience using Ally. And this is not I'm not a salesperson, I'm just a strategist. So I'm not trying to sell this at all. But I think what some of her experiences were in, shedding some light on some gaps that we have. And I don't think it's only in, specifically in terms of Anthology Ally, it's just in general, and we're talking about accessibility. And I think this kind of goes back to my earlier point that accessibility is often left out of that DEIB alphabet soup. So some of the takeaways, she talked about the ability to have this be an autonomous experience. So, and also, it's also for students, what I'm trying to say, sorry, I feel like the coffee has just stopped hitting my my brain. But what I really mean to say here is that there is nobody at Anthology is able to tell which student is downloading what. It's completely confidential. So it's anonymous. It's also autonomous. She talked a lot about the flexibility and having that be something that's comforting, and that I can also respect myself. The multiple options, and this really just kind of goes back to that idea of multiplicity and when we're thinking about UDL. But she really also talked about the lack of communication and not knowing a lot about this. And I can say that as both an instructor and then now a strategist, we see this a lot. And this is not we're not trying to put blame on anybody, but I've always felt, that a lot of this has to just do with, again, that accessibility component being left out of things a lot. And so what I have on this next slide are just a couple different suggestions for how to communicate with students about alternative formats. But also there are some things in here that can be used even if your institution does not have Ally. So always including information in your syllabus. I know there are memes and t-shirts and mugs and everything that says it's on the syllabus, and there is some pushback about, making sure that students are reading it. But I think first and foremost, it sets that tone of including that information there, announcing to your class or even via your LMS. So if you're only meeting virtually, then this is also something that can be kind of formatted as an announcement. Providing additional guidance. And, in this instance, what I usually do is I'll create like a separate learning module or folder, a content folder, and call that student resources, and then have the links and things like that to different spaces on campus, or also just other suggestions on how to make things more accessible. So they have the information right there. And it, again, just makes it more accessible. Doing a demonstration in class. I think this is really helpful, especially as the instructor. It's really up to us. We have that, constant engagement and interaction with our students. So we want to make sure we're sharing that information. And if it's fully virtual and it's asynchronous, recording a video to demonstrate how these alternative formats can be accessed, I think is really helpful as well. And the last thing I have on here is really about writing an accessibility statement. So this is, I think such an important component of our modern syllabi and what should be included. And there are some institutions that might already have like a preset accessibility statement, but if there is space for you to add more to this, then I would suggest, doing that, or if you can write your own. This is just some of the information that we suggest including. So what is your individual explicit commitment to accessibility? What's the contact information for your institution's accessibility office? Also, are there any specific classroom accommodations that you yourself typically provide just kind of universally? That could also be the availability of the alternative formats. So explicitly calling that out and letting students know that this is an option for them. And then I always typically include like an open invitation for students to approach me with any questions or concerns, but also to, reiterate and explicitly state that I am not the accessibility office. I'm just here to help them, and I can guide them to the next, space if they need that. So I think really just overall thinking about different things that we can do regarding communication and making that, accessibility be more part of that conversation and initiative. And if, Ally alternative formats is part of that, I think that's fantastic. But a lot of these other suggestions could easily be applied, for instances and institutions that are not using Ally. So I am not in a rush to go anywhere. I'm happy to kind of open up the floor now and answer questions. I'm actually going to pause sharing my screen and then restart my video so that I can see everybody or answer any questions if there are any. I'm going to open up the chat as well. Let's see, I'm just looking through things.
Katie, thank you so much for this wonderful session. I really appreciate it. And I also would like to thank Anthology for being a sponsor for this conference. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
And of course. And one thing I would like to say about UDL is, like, I know it's a wonderful tool, but I also know that it's really, really overwhelming sometimes to, like, oh my
Agreed.
gosh, how am I going to do it, right? But
Totally agree.
The way you phrased it is so, like, soothing, and okay, we need to do this slowly, we're gonna do it, so thank you
Baby
so
steps.
much.
Yeah.
Yes, baby steps, absolutely.
Baby
We can't do it
steps, yeah.
all at once, right? So thank
No.
you so much for that.
Thank
And
you.
also thank you for reminding us that, like, accessibility is left out in all the most DEI rubrics or frameworks or whatever, but thank you for reminding us that. I think it's super important to just keep that in mind and make adjustments accordingly, right?
Yep.
And so I would like to just go back to the audience to see if they have any questions for Katie. I'm sure you're familiar with Ally because Peralta uses Ally as well. So if you have any Ally specific questions or UDL specific questions or accessibility in general, Katie is here.
And I also put my, I'll put my email in the chat for everybody. Let's see.
Yeah. Okay, I see one question here. If Ally alternative format options is not available in Canvas, instructors do not need to learn how to design a course with accessibility in mind?
I would not say that, no. So really, Ally at the end of the day is a tool to help to give more access to students, but it's also to help instructors learn how to make things more accessible. So when you're designing a course, you want to have it be accessible from the beginning, and then look at Anthology Ally as a tool to help you improve that along the way. So there still is a human element that is needed. And what I mean by that in particular is, the more accessible your original version of the document is, so let's say your syllabus is, the better experience it will be for a student that is going to access that as an alternative format. So it's kind of like quality in, quality out, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that helped. Vivian, I think that's a good question, but I think one way to look at it is that Ally is a tool in the entire process of making things more accessible and approaching your course from an accessible standpoint. But I would say for sure it is good to create and design a course with accessibility in mind, and that definition can expand in a lot of different areas. Like if we're even thinking about cost of materials, I would argue that has selecting those from the beginning has a lot to do with like equitable accessibility, right? So there's one. Thinking about whether or not students can record lectures so that they can go back to it if you want, or if they need to, or something like that. Making sure that there is a flexible policy when it comes to emergencies and things like that. Setting clear expectations. Like a lot of these components of creating something, making a class accessible from the beginning, also align a lot with the whole kind of movement of decolonizing the syllabus. So it's just breaking things down and making it more accessible, relatable, giving everybody the chance to approach the class from the equitable standpoint. Sorry, I talk a lot.
No, yeah, I'm also checking
my reaction.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. And I also think that it's kind of like a requirement by federal requirement as well, right? Making digital materials accessible for all. So it's a little bit overwhelming. I totally agree. And I wish it was everything was accessible by default, right? By default, we don't need to do anything. Everything would be accessible for everyone, but unfortunately we're not there yet. So, but hopefully we'll get there. And thank you for that question, Vivian. It's a very important question to ask. And I would like to end this session if you don't have any other final questions or comments. And Katie, thank you so much again. We appreciate you. And have a wonderful rest of your days. And please subscribe for our YouTube channel to see all the recordings. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Everybody enjoy the conference.